Chapter 14, Maximus with quiet steps. I neared the doorway, peering into the room. I watched as Evel unfolded clothing and piled them into a suitcase. Upon further examination, I saw silent tears pouring down her face. Knocking on the door frame, I stepped into the room as her head shot up in my direction. "Oh," she whispered. She wiped her tears with her sleeve. "Hi," she muttered with a half-smile. I kneeled before her, watching as she continued packing her belongings. "Evelyn," I muttered. "Ev," I said louder and more clearly this time, clasping her hand that had been reaching for a pile of folded shirts. She turned her head and looked at me meekly. "What?" "Max, you know it's okay to not be okay, right?" I asked, searching her golden eyes. "You don't have to be okay. I know." She nodded as a few tears strayed down her face. "But I just..." Her gaze held an air of expectation, as if she was waiting with trepidation for something to come. "I don't want to do this right now. It's just a lot." I nodded my head thoughtfully, pressing a kiss to her forehead. I wasn't going to press it now, but I could tell something deeper than moving was bothering her. When the time came, I would find out what it was. Standing up, I left the room, leaving her to pack her bags in silence. Rounding the corner, I knocked into someone. I heard a groan. "Oh, fudge. Oh gosh, I'm sorry." I apologized, recognizing my mate's friend. "Don't worry about it." She smiled, waving her hand. She peered over my shoulder and down the hall before leaning in and whispering, "How is she doing?" "Best she can be, given the circumstances." I paused, mulling something over as she started to walk past me. "Kayla, I don't want to screw up here. You're her best friend. Am I missing something?" How bad is moving away for her? Kayla offered me a small grin. "She will be okay. She just needs time. And as for moving, just make sure she feels at home." Home? My house was not a home. I didn't even know if I was capable of providing one. But maybe with Evelyn there, it could be. I knew it would be. The dark memories that seemed to haunt me might flee from the walls in her presence and be extinguished from existence. I'm ready." I turned around in the kitchen and looked at Evelyn, who had Kayla standing next to her. She had 4 suitcases, all full of her most precious belongings. Even though I could have bought her an entirely new wardrobe, I insisted she brought every item that was precious to her. To force her to bring nothing, to start completely over, would have been a monstrous act. "You be safe, okay? FaceTime me whenever you can. Oh, I love you so much, APA. Don't let me down. You continue to be your marvelous self, okay?" Kayla asked as she wrapped her arms around Evelyn. "I'll be okay." Evelyn smiled as she squeezed Kayla. Pulling away, the 2 girls wordlessly expressed their love for one another. "I'm going to go, okay? I just wanted to say goodbye," Kayla muttered, wiping her tears on her sleeve. Evelyn nodded and watched as her friend left her home. I moved to step forward and felt a firm, calloused hand grip my shoulder. Turning around, I faced Alpha Smith. He reached for my hand in a shake, and I took it, noting the firm pressure he placed. Leaning forward, "Take care of my daughter. Guard her with your life." Despite the wrinkles on his face, white hair, and lanky structure, Alpha Smith was anything but fragile. He was a force to be reckoned with. He cemented that fact with his handshake. I nodded while shaking his hand, a subtle seal of agreement between us. Evelyn would never know harm if I had anything to do with it. "Honey, I love you. If you need anything at all, give me a call." Her mother consoled her daughter, wrapping her in hug. I watched the mother and daughter quietly cry in each other's arms. "Mom," Evelyn raised her hand to her mother's cheek. "I love you. I may not understand why you did what you did, but I love you." And she paused and looked into her mother's eyes, a tender grin making way to her face, eliciting butterflies in my stomach. "And I forgive you." Mom Luna Smith lunged forward, holding her daughter tightly as she sobbed. Alpha Smith my side and walked up to the duo, wrapping his arms around them both. "I love you." To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noble, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Stay safe. He spoke with care, pressing a kiss to her forehead. She grabbed his forearm. Dad, I love you and I forgive you too. It was moments like this, watching her, that I couldn't help but be in awe. Most would have seethed and pulled away at their parents' betrayal, but Evelyn was steadfast in her loyalty. She was able to have understanding amidst her confusion. It was one of the reasons I loved her. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noble, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I wasn't ready to tell her yet. Lula Smith stepped aside, allowing father and daughter to give each other a large hug. Pulling away, Evelyn looked at me with eyes that indicated she was ready to go. Nodding my head, I walked towards them, grabbing some of her bags, while her father grabbed the others. We loaded the trunk of my car. I shook Alpha Smith's hand one last time and found myself surprised when this time he pulled me in for a hug. Arms wrapped around me. He spoke lowly. I trust you. Maximus, I trust you. Trust. That was huge. A feeling of comfort washed over me knowing that my mate's father trusted his daughter with me. Thank you. Sir, I whispered before getting into the car. Evelyn grabbed the door handle and opened the car door. However, her face held apprehension. She looked at the seat, up at me, and then back at her parents. Evelyn, I whispered. She whipped her head around, looking at me with a large watery gaze. Say goodbye one more time. Nodding, she ran from the car back up to her parents and wrapped them in a hug. The trio hugged for a few moments, her parents muttering sweet nothing and words of comfort to her. Then, she waved goodbye, getting in the car, and closing the door. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noble, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I turned to ask her. Ready? She nodded with a smile. She wiped her straying tears with her sleeve. As I pulled away from her childhood home, I glanced at Evelyn, who stared intensely at the window. She watched as the scenery of her neighborhood faded from view, and as we passed through her town, a bittersweet smile crossed her face. I turned on my blinker, turning down a road towards the library. What are you doing? Maximus, Evelyn asked. Her exterior was calm but her voice edged with alarm. I grabbed her hand and gave it a squeeze before parking the car. She turned to me, eyes wide and questioning, as she stared at the old oak building. Max, why are we here? I held up the book I had taken from the library weeks earlier, making an O sound. She nodded in realization. I got out of the car and Evelyn stayed put. Walking around, I opened her door and she looked at me in surprise. Come on, I urged, reaching out a hand for her to take. Maximus, I can't. Her voice cracked as she glanced at the library. I saw how her form crumpled, but I also knew she would regret not saying goodbye. Come on, Ev. Come on, I whispered as I unbuckled her seat and grabbed her hand gently, deciding not to fight against me. Evelyn followed my gentle pull and got out of the car. Walking towards the library, I felt her tremble slightly as she fought her grief. I held her hand tighter, giving it a gentle squeeze. As we walked in, Mrs. Peters glanced up from the circular desk. She glowed at Evelyn and glanced at me, offering a wink. Everything was set. Hi, Mrs. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noble, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Evelyn whispered. The jubilant woman walked in large strides despite her tiny legs and wrapped her arms around Evelyn. You didn't think you could leave without saying goodbye, did you? I eyed Evelyn and burst into tears. And Mrs. Peters rubbed her back in consolation. There, darling. Everything is going to be fine. She smiled through the tears that had emerged on her own face. Turning to me, Mrs. Peters offered a grin. Alpha Alexander, would you endeavor and do me a favor and return that book to the children's section? I nodded and took a step towards Evelyn, then walked with her to the children's section. As we approached the corner, stifled giggles could be heard and I had to stop myself from grinning. Surprise! A chorus of voices shouted. Evelyn shrieked and then laughed. Holding her chest, tears streamed down her face as she glowed at the 12 children she knew and adored. Each child was a regular listener at her story times, and Evelyn knew each of them incredibly well. Arms reaching out, Evelyn managed her best to hug them, as they gathered in a circle around her. "We will miss you, Miss Evelyn." Rosie pouted. "I'll miss Evelyn the most," Michael declared, puffing his chest up. "No, I will." A little girl in pigtails, who I hadn't met, argued, crossing her arms. Soon, all the children were arguing as a chorus of no's filled the air. Evelyn laughed but soon stopped as a strong hacking sound filled the air. Evelyn raised her head, looking around the room. The old gentleman paused and coughed. I will miss Evelyn the most." I watched as Evelyn's eyes softened, spotting Mr. Weaver, Maudie, and Connor, carefully stepping away from the children. She walked up to Mr. Weaver with a sense of we Mr. Weaver, she breathed. "What are you doing out of the hospital?" The old man sat in a wheelchair, arms looking gaunt as he breathed through a nasal cannula. He hacked more. Maudie put a hand on his shoulder and smiled down at her grandfather. "He insisted he come and see you off." She looked up at Evelyn. "I'll admit I wasn't for it at first, but," she paused and smiled, "I wanted to say goodbye too." Evelyn grinned, stepping forward and wrapping Maudie into a tight hug. The two girls clung to each other for a few moments. "I'm going to miss you so much," Evelyn whispered. "I'm going to miss you too," Maudie sniffled. They released their hug, hands holding one another. Tears filled Maudie's eyes and she moved to wipe them. "Don't cry," my mate's voice broke. "If you cry, I'll cry and we can't have that." She laughed, blinking back tears. I turned to Connor. "Thank you for bringing them. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nelban. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." This meant the world to Maudie. "See you in a few weeks." "Let's hope for a few months." Connor winced. A reminder that him being back would mean Mr. Weaver's death. I nodded, then turned my attention back to Evelyn and Mr. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nelban. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Evelyn had thought to do the same, as she turned from Maudie towards Mr. Weaver, and a somber smile broke out on her face. "Mr. Weaver," she muttered, bending down to his level. "You didn't think you could." He paused and coughed. "Leave without saying goodbye now, did you?" He smiled through trembling. Tears filled Evelyn's eyes. No, I didn't." She wrapped her arms around him in a hug. "Now I need you to do something, Evelyn." Mr. Weaver stammered. She nodded. "Anything, Mr. Anything. Do you go read a story to those kiddos?" He grinned, winking at her, with a smile. Evelyn nodded, standing up and making her way over to the rocking chair. The children of Ice Valley flooded around her in anticipation. Grabbing a book from the shelf, Evelyn sat down and began the story. I leaned against the library shelf and watched with a smile as she elicited large sounds to aid the story. I watched her eyes grow large, describing certain parts, making the children giggle. I admired how she would lower her voice and whisper when calamity was going to strike. The children were entranced by her display, and I found myself to be entranced as well. But it wasn't by the story. No, it was her. I imagined her reading to the pups from my pack, in our large town library. It had lacked use for the last few years, but I knew Evelyn would want to revitalize it when we got to North Wind. I imagined her reading stories to our own children, the way they would giggle and smile as she used words to transport them to lands of old. My heart eared in happiness and in fear at my thoughts. Happiness at what was to come, and fear that it would never happen. Going to North Wind might change everything. Eventually, Evelyn would notice the whispering. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nelban. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. The darkness, that hung over North Wind, and she would ask questions that would likely lead to her hating me, seeing me as the monster my pack seemed to see. I was broken from my thoughts when soft hands grabbed my own and a cool feeling passed through my wrist. "Hey, Max," my mate's tender voice questioned. She must have finished reading. I looked down at her with a grin. She was radiant, beaming up at me with a smile. I loved how when she was this close, I could see her precious freckles. Her eyes were large and seemed to hold the wonders of the world in them. "Ready to go?" I questioned. "Yes, I'm ready." She smiled with a nod, waving goodbye to the children. Mutty, Connor, and Mr. Weaver. We walked towards the doors. Evelyn stopped and gave Mrs. Peters a large hug, whispering thanks into her ear. "Stay safe, sweet girl." Mrs. Peters smiled, holding Evelyn's cheek. She leaned in, hugging Evelyn, and whispering in Evelyn's ear. But she knew I could hear her, and enjoy the handsome man. I heard a small gasp and chuckled to myself as Mrs. Peters winked over Evelyn's shoulder, blushing furiously. Evelyn waved goodbye and walked up to me, taking the hand I had put out for her. Her small fingers slipped into mine, fitting perfectly, as we exited the library and got into the car. "Max," Evelyn said, turning to me as I started the engine. I asked as I faced her. Thank you so much." She smiled before leaning and unpacking my lips. I stifled my surprise and simply smiled. "To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." Hours passed, and Evelyn sat silently in the car. She stared out the window, occasionally smiling or pointing out an animal, a pretty sight. The silence wasn't heavy and stifling, though. Rather, it was peaceful and tranquil, laying over us like a weighted blanket. At one point, Evelyn had fallen asleep, and I admired her with a smile. In her sleep, she mumbled my name. Then, she reached a tentative hand out, searching for my own, shifting and turning until I grabbed hers. Then, her whole body leaned towards me as her delicate fingers wrapped around my own. Looking at our surroundings, I decided it was time to wake her up. "Evelyn," I whispered, kissing the back of the hand I held. She groaned, shaking her head. I chuckled. "Evelyn, we are getting close." Blinking open her eyes, she yawned and looked at our connected hands with a blush. "Oh," she grinned, looking out the window. By now, night had fallen and it was dark out. I expected her to release my hand, but instead she held on loosely. Peering out the window, the night warning sign came into view, and I quickly pointed it out to Evelyn, even though I knew her vision wasn't as good as mine in the dark. We wound through the roads and then my home came into view. Turning into the long driveway, I pulled up to the house and heard an audible gasp from Evelyn. "Is everything okay?" I asked her, searching her body for a sign of harm. She turned to me with a look of astonishment. "Max, this was what I described to the WOLAU. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." "This is it," she gaped with a grin. I smiled at her, getting out of the car and walking around to get her door. Walking her up to the house, I opened a door. The high ceilings towered over us, and instead of being mortified by the emptiness, Evelyn smiled in delight. "This is gorgeous," she explained, walking towards the large windows which looked out over the lake. In the dark, the moon seemed to illuminate them, flooding the house with light. She turned to look at the fireplace and smiled even wider. "Have you always had this?" she asked in wonder. "Yeah." I nodded. "Yeah. I can't believe this is your home," she whispered, looking around in awe. "It's strange how dreams can be real." "Our home," I muttered in correction. "Home." The word seemed foreign when it rolled off my lips. I had referred to the cabin as a house for so long, seeming to be voided of what the feeling of home truly was. I had been told years before that the cabin, the house, I occupied had once been full of light and love, full of laughter and joy. It had been a home. In the first few years of my life, even I remembered the warmth it held. My father would hold me and tell me bedtime stories by the fire with animated faces and voices. He would tell me stories of my mother's kindness in life with exuberance and passion. Despite my birth being the reason she died, not once did he blame her death on me. No, that blame and shame came later. But in those early years, my time with him was cherished. He told me about the moon goddess plan, and how all things happened in a season for a reason. Most of all, he told me about mates, how wonderful they were, and what a blessing from our Creator they were. He told me my mother would want me to know about the beauty of having a mate, how she would tell me to cherish and love her, how a mate would cherish and love you. Looking at Evelyn's beaming face, I felt the stories of old reigniting something in me, a sense of hope and vision. I hoped that one day my mother's teaching would become true. One day my mate, my beautiful mate, would make this dark place a home. Looking at her, a light in this dark house, I knew it would come true. Soon, it would be our home. Chapter 15, Evelyn. Pulling away from my home. My beautiful childhood home. I stared with a longing gaze out the window. Slowly, my small neighborhood faded from view, and as we passed through Ice Valley, tears filled my eyes as a gentle smile filled my lips. I will miss this place. Suddenly, Max turned on the car blinker, turning down an old familiar road. I scrunched my brows in confusion. What are you doing, Maximus? I tried to keep my face passive, but my voice betrayed me with a slight tremble. I was anxious. Max reached out and grabbed my hand, giving it a gentle and reassuring squeeze, before pulling up to the library and parking the car. I turned to him with wide eyes and then looked back to the old oak building. Max, why are we here? He offered a half smile, holding up the book he had taken from the library weeks earlier. Oh, I breathed out faintly. He got out of the car and I sat still, expecting him to go in without me. There was simply no way I could face Mrs. To my agent extraordinaire, Evelyn and Maximus, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. However, Max surprised me, walking around the car and opening my door. Come on. Reaching out a hand for me to take. My body trembled with dread, as a nauseous feeling pulled in my stomach. Maximus. I can't. My voice cracked as I looked up at the library. The library had been a part of my home just as much as my house had. It had books that had supported me in times of trouble, and the library had Mrs. To my agent extraordinaire, Evelyn and Maximus, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. My grandparents had died long before my parents found me, and in many ways, Mrs. Peters was my grandmother. To say goodbye would be too much to bear. I looked at Maximus again, his hand outstretched to mine. Come on, Ev. Come on. Reaching his arms across me and unbuckling my seat, he gently grabbed my hand. I realized then that not saying goodbye to Mrs. Peters would be more unbearable than doing it. So, rather than fight against Max, I let his strong but tender grip pull me out of the car. I trembled as we approached the library, fearing how I would handle saying goodbye. Tears fought to surface, but I fought harder against them, feeling Maximus give my hand another reassuring squeeze. As we walked in, Mrs. Peters glanced up from the circular desk. She gave me a vibrant smile and then glanced at Maximus, giving him a wink. My forehead crinkled. What is going on? Hi, Mrs. To my agent extraordinaire, Evelyn and Maximus, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I whispered with a smile. With enthusiasm. She walked in large strides and wrapped her arms tightly around me. You didn't think you could leave without saying goodbye, did you? Wrenching guilt poured into me, and I felt like I was punched in the gut, bursting into tears. All I could muster was, I, Mrs. Peters rubbed my back in consolation. There, darling. Everything is going to be fine. She smiled through tears that had begun to pour down her face. Turning to Maximus, Mrs. Peters offered a cat-like grin. Something strange was definitely going on. Alpha Alexander, would you and Evelyn do me a favor and return that book to the children's section? He nodded, taking a step toward me before we walked to the children's section. I heard a strange muffled sound before I found myself shrieking and laughing as a chorus of voices shouted. Surprise! Tears streamed down my face as I smiled in awe at the 12 children I loved. Each child was a regular listener at my story times. I reached my arms out as they swarmed me, doing my best to hug them in a group before hugging each child individually. We will miss you, Miss Evelyn, Rosie declared with a frown. Oh, Miss Evelyn the most. Michael butted in, puffing his chest up and clearly aiming to impress. It garnered a giggle from me which I concealed by putting a hand to my mouth. No, I will, Ella argued, crossing her arms. Her blonde pigtails bobbed as an angry expression passed her face. Before I knew it, every child was arguing as a chorus of no's filled the air. I laughed but found myself pausing and looking up as a strong coughing sound filled the air. A rough voice passed and coughed. I will miss Evelyn the most. My eyes fell on Mr. Weaver, who was accompanied by Maudie and Connor. The children parted, allowing me to walk up to Mr. Agent Extraordinaire, Mademoiselle Noble. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Sadness and joy at seeing him filled me, Mr. Weaver. I breathed, almost shaking my head. What are you doing out of the hospital? He sat in his wheelchair looking gaunt as he breathed through a nasal cannula. Coughing more, Maudie put a hand on his shoulder and smiled down at him, hoping to spare him the pain of an answer. He insisted he come and see you off. She looked up at me. I'll admit I wasn't for it at first, but she paused and smiled. I wanted to say goodbye too. I grinned, stepping forward and wrapping Maudie into a tight hug. We clung to each other, neither one wanting to let go. I'm going to miss you so much, I whispered. I'm going to miss you too. Maudie sniffled, releasing our grip on each other. Our hands held onto one another. Tears filled Maudie's eyes and she moved to wipe them. Don't cry. My voice cracked, revealing my despair. I'll cry and we can't have that. I laughed, attempting to blink back tears. I turned from Maudie towards Mr. Weaver and a somber smile filled my face. Mr. Weaver, I muttered, bending down so that he and I were face to face. I didn't want him to feel weak. I wanted him to feel level with me. Idie didn't think you could. He paused and coughed. Leave without saying, gee, goodbye now, did you? He smiled through trembling. My eyes filled with tears and this time I couldn't hold them back. They poured down my face as I choked out. No, I didn't. I wrapped my arms around his tiny frame tightly, knowing well this would be my last time to hug and see him before he passed. Now I need you to do something, Evelyn, Mr. Weaver stammered. I nodded. Anything, mister. Anything. Go read a story to those kiddos. He grinned, winking at me. It pained me to do so, but Mr. Weaver didn't have to know that. So, plastering on a smile, I nodded. I stood up and made my way over to the rocking chair, grabbing a book from the shelf on my way, sitting down in the chair. My children flooded around me in gleeful anticipation, beginning the story. I forced my feelings of sadness and lost down. The children didn't need to see that. They needed to see the Evelyn they knew and loved. The Evelyn I still was, even if so much had changed. Using my usual character voices, I tried my best to make the story come alive, looking at their beaming and intrigued faces. Oh, how I will miss them. Maybe if I was lucky there would be children in North Wind I could take under my wing. Children I could read to. Amid the story, I glanced at Maximus' face. He appeared to be in deep thought. His light blue eyes seemed deep blue like the ocean for a moment. I looked at his dark hair which was swept out of his eyes. We hardly knew each other, but an image of the children I had dreamed to mind and warmth filled me. Maybe I will have my own children to read too. Refocusing on the story, I carried on. When the story was finished, I embraced each child in my arms, telling them that I would do my best to visit. Walking up to Maximus, I couldn't help but grab his calloused hand, breaking him out of thought. The strange and yet wonderful sensation of energy passing through our wrists broke out the moment I did. "Hey, Max," I questioned. He looked down at me with a grin. There was something so beautiful about his smile. It was indescribable, like a warm fire in a winter storm. The feeling of comfort passed from my head to the tips of my toes as he gleamed at me. "Ready to go?" he asked gently. "Yes, I'm ready." I smiled with a nod. I waved goodbye to the children, Muddy, Connor, and Mr. Weaver, and we walked towards the doors. I stopped when I saw Mrs. "Agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." Letting go of Maximus, hand as I wrapped her into a large hug. "Thank you for everything. Absolutely everything," I whispered. "I'll miss you so much." Pulling away, she looked down at me with a smile. She held my cheek. "Stay safe, sweet girl." She leaned in for one more hug and whispered, "And enjoy that handsome man." I gasped, eyes going wide. Mrs. Peters pulled away, my face so pink she laughed. I waved one last goodbye. Before walking up to Maximus, I took the hand he put out for me, noting how much tinier mine was in comparison to his. We exited the library and got in the car. Sitting and staring at the library, I was filled with contentment and my prior sadness seemed diminished. It struck me, then, that Maximus had been the one to plan it all. Our coming to the library was no sheer accident. It was him all along. A feeling of tenderness washed over me as I found myself overwhelmed by his kindness and thoughtfulness. I whispered as he started the engine, turning to face me. "Thank you. Thank you so much." Without a thought, my hands reached out to his face and I leaned in and pecked his lips. Pulling away, he smiled down at me, looking as if he had conquered the world. My heart thundered in my chest as his velvety baritone voice whispered, "To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." "Evelyn," I heard a whisper. Soft lips kissed the back of my hand, as a rough large hand that was warm and familiar held it. Ignoring the whisper, I shook my head and groaned. A deep chuckle rumbled out into the silence of the car as I became more aware of the presence beside me. "Evelyn, we are getting close." Blinking my eyes open, I took in Maximus's face. He offered a small smile, and I grinned back. Yawning, looking down at my hand, I blushed, seeing they were connected. "Oh," I whispered, tucking a piece of hair behind my ear with my free hand. Before looking out the window, night had fallen. I took in the new terrain. We were high in the mountains, the tall familiar trees of Alaska enveloping us. The area seemed more rural than Ice Valley in some way. A difficult feat. "There's the night wind welcome sign," Maximus whispered, pointing out into the dark tree line. I leaned up in my seat, looking into the dark, lightly illuminated by the car's headlights. A black rusty sign with yellow letters read, "Night Wind." I smiled at the sight. Next turned down a multitude of roads until we were on an icy dirt road, one far secluded from the main highway. Looking out the car window, a 2-story cabin came into view and my heart skipped a beat. Is this his home? My question was soon answered as we turned into the long driveway that led to the monumental home. As Max pulled up to the house, I gasped. Closer up, it was larger and grander than I had expected. A beautiful log porch wrapped around the front. Max didn't seem ecstatic to be home, but I was thrilled. Cabins always seemed to be warm and inviting places to me, places I dreamed of living in. "Is everything okay?" Max asked me. I turned to him and saw him looking my body up and down, causing me to blush at the intensity of his gaze. I began with a smile. This was what I described to the WLRU. "To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." "This is it," I grinned. I gaped at the house which seemed to fulfill my dreams. He smiled at me, getting out of the car and walking around to open my door. Thank you. I followed his lead as we walked up an illuminated path to the house. I waited in anticipation as he opened the door. Stepping over the threshold seemed to be sealing my fate, and I shook with nervousness but buried it down. This was going to be my home. I needed to embrace it. So, with trepidation, I stepped into the house. I looked with wide eyes at the hive-altered ceilings, loving the openness they gave the house. The beams that went across them were a beautiful detail. Stepping further into the house, I was in awe as I approached towering windows that looked out onto the terrain. A massive lake outstretched behind the home, with large mountain peaks surrounding it like a hug. The stars and moon reflected on the lake, flooding the plain with light. This is gorgeous, I exclaimed, turning to face Maximus. My eyes fell on the fireplace. An overwhelming sensation of gratitude and joy swept over me. It seemed unreal. The house seemed to be pulled directly out of the dreams I'd had since I was a little girl. Have you always had this? I asked in disbelief. Had he purchased this home for me? Could it be possible he already owned the home that fit my exact description? Yeah, he nodded, tucking his hands into his pockets. Yeah. I was struck with the incredibleness of that fact. It was like a perfectly crafted story by an author. I can't believe this is your home, I whispered, looking around in awe. It's strange how dreams can be real. Our home, he muttered in correction. I grinned at that thought. It didn't feel like my home yet, but I knew it would. This house had everything but a feminine touch. The furniture was dark, and the atmosphere was domineering. It seemed like a female hadn't been in the house in years. But I knew with time and attention it could be made beautiful. It was that future prospect that I held on to. I held hope in the could be, rather than focusing on what the house was not. Want a house tour? Max asked, snapping me out of my thought. I turned to him and nodded with a smile, taking his hand into my own. He led me through a small corridor into a room adjacent to the living room, which turned out to be the kitchen. My gaze widened and my heartbeat quickened. It was identical to the one from my dream weeks prior. If I had any doubt now at this soulmate business, it was extinguished. Letting my hand slip from his, I took soft steps towards the island, and then to the stove. Reaching out a tentative hand, I allowed my hands to rub over the grey marble countertops. The kitchen had beautiful wooden cabinets and copper-toned faucets. I felt a feather, like touch graze over my shoulder. Evelyn, are you all right? Max asked, voice laced in concern. I turned around and nodded. It's just... I trembled slightly at the reality I was going to admit. I dreamt of this place. This place is where my dream was. A small smile tugged on his lips. Mine as well. I raised my eyebrows at his admission, knowing we very well had dreamt the same thing. It was strange, and I knew I'd have to ask him more about it later. Max cleared his throat, ready to see the rest. I nodded. Max showed me the downstairs bathroom, a guest room, and the dining room before he took me upstairs. There were 2 stairs that led to the top, a room sitting in between both. What's in there? Pointing a finger in its direction. I'm saving that for last. Walking to the left, Max stopped in the middle of the hallway. That, he pointed to 2 large doors at the end of the hall, is my room. If you need anything, he turned to me and looked me in the eye. And I mean anything at all. Come and get me. I nodded. And that, he pointed to a door that was to the left of the large doors, is my office. I'm in there more often than my bedroom, so just knock and check in with me there first. Again, I nodded, noting that important fact. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noble, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Let's go this way, Max said, leading us to the right. We walked down the hall, passing the mystery room. Those, Max pointed at 2 rooms on the left of the hall, our guest rooms. We walked past the first one, and then past the adjacent, looking at a room that was across from it. A beautiful oak door stood before us. "This is your room." Maximus twisted the brass knob, opened the door for me, and allowed me to enter first. Stepping in, the room was painted in light lilac, one of my favorite colors. The bed was a queen, featuring a white duvet covered with a quilt that had small lilac-colored flowers on it. There was a dresser, and walking around the bed towards a door to my left, I found a massive walk-in closet. It held many racks on both walls and shelving for shoes on the back wall. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nobin, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I walked around the bed, to the right of the room, opening the door. A bathroom was revealed. It had a large glass shower, which was placed beside a deep tub that overlooked the mountains and lake through a large adjacent window. I stood silent for a few moments, admiring the view and absorbing the care and attention that had been put into the room. "What do you think?" Maximus asked. His voice was confident as usual, but I felt a tad of nervousness roll off of him, as his hands interlaced behind his back. "It's perfect. Let me get your luggage," Max said, before I could protest and offer to help. He had left. A few minutes later, he came up with 2 of my suitcases. "Thank you." I smiled, taking the suitcases from him. "You didn't have to do that, you know," I added with a grin. He was so gentlemanly. "Of course I did," Max stated like a fact, "and I don't mind doing it." He glanced down at his watch. "If it's all right, I'll get the rest of your luggage in the morning. It's 12 a.m. I want you to get some sleep." I nodded. "Good night, Evelyn." He half smiled, walking towards the door. "Good night, Max." To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nobin, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Following behind him so I could close the door, he paused in the doorway, turning around. "If you need anything again, anything at all." I cut him off, pressing a kiss to his lips. I pulled away quickly, looking up at his raised brows. "I'll get you." I nodded. As I went to turn around and shut the door, Max put out an arm and caught it. I felt arms snake around my waist, pulling me back and turning me around. Dipping his head, Maximus kissed me softly, moving his mouth against mine, until I responded, wrapping my arms around his neck. He pulled me tighter against him, delving into my mouth further and deepening the kiss. It felt so right. He felt so right. He released me, hands gripping my hips as he pressed his forehead to mine, opening my eyes. His ice blue ones bore into mine, his pupils dilated and somber. Maximus had once described a mate bond, and in some way, I felt it then. It was as if I could feel his feelings. He was happy, but he also had a lingering feeling of being afraid. To our agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nobin, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I wasn't sure, but his eyes seemed to be trying to convey his fear without a word being shared. I reached out a tentative hand, brushing hair out of his face, and in doing so was reminded of my dream. With a smile, I whispered, "Good night, Maximus." "Good night, Ev," he whispered back, slowly pulling his body away from mine and leaving. I tossed and turned in bed, my breath growing shallow, the confines of my mind stuck in a loop of torture. No air, dying. Help, help, Max. Next, the icy clutch of the water wrapped around me. I shot up in bed in a cold sweat, fighting away the cold water's frigid grip. I gasped for air, but none would fill my lungs. Hyperventilating, I swatted at the frigid grip. No. The cold was trying to drown me. Air. I need air. Evelyn, it's me. Max spoke into the silence. I opened my eyes, looking up at him through tears as he released his grip on me. I felt without clothes and vulnerable. Under his gaze, my demons had come out and here he was, witnessing it all. I'm sorry, I cried. I continued to fail to fill my lungs with air despite waking up. No, he hushed me, pulling me back in. He held my back against his chest, gently rocking me as I suffocated on nothing. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I fought to get air. Doom seemed to be taking over my being. I am going to die. Evelyn, you're having a panic attack. Max whispered in my ear. I want you to find 5 things you see and say them out loud. Through my wheezing, I looked around me. Her arms. Breath. Breath. Sheets. Breath. Pillow. WS. Breath. Ed. My breathing was still shallow, but I felt the panic and looming distraction I had felt begin to withdraw. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Good. Moving his hands to rub my shoulders. Now, say for things you feel. W, warmth. S, sheet. Soft CL, clothes. I paused hyperventilating, placing a hand on my chest. Why you? Name 3 things you hear. He whispered. B, breath. T, the AC. Wind. My breath was beginning to even, despite it being shallow. To things you smell. Pine. Coffee. 1 thing you taste. I closed my eyes and breathed in deeply this time, tasting a subtle bit of mint from my toothpaste. Mint toothpaste. Max hugged me tightly and hummed as I leaned against him. My mind was calmed, and I was enveloped in a feeling of safety. The warmth that radiated from him, paired with his strong arms around me, assured me. As I faded into the land of dreams, I felt him lay us down, and slowly tried to pull away. Reaching my hands out, I grabbed the collar of his shirt and whispered, "Please don't leave. I don't want to be alone." Max whispered, "Are you sure?" "Evelyn." I nodded without opening my eyes, arms reaching out. Normally I would have felt embarrassed by my behavior, especially with the chuckle Max released, but at that moment I knew I needed him. Feeling the bed dip, I turned over on my side, as Max wrapped his arms around my waist. In a cocoon of comfort, a soft and all-too-familiar hum emitted from his chest, and I found myself pulled into the land of sleep. I slept well, knowing no nightmares would plague me with Max by my side. Chapter 16, Maximus. I woke up grinning to myself. My mate's precious body snuggled against me, my arms wrapped around her. Opening my eyes, I looked down at her beautiful sleeping face. It was so calm, with a small grin painting her pink lips. It contrasted so greatly with the night before's terrors that I may have forgotten they existed, yet I couldn't. I woke up with a start, hearing screams from down the hall. My eyes shot wide as I sprinted to Evelyn's bedroom, hearing her cry my name. Fear overtook my senses in a way I hadn't felt in years as panic filled my chest. Swinging the door open, I saw Evelyn shaking from hyperventilating in her sleep. I walked over to her and gently shook her, calling out her name. No. She sobbed, sitting upright. She was awake but refused to open her eyes, every sign of panic on her face. She tried to shake my arms off, but I held her tighter. "Evelyn, it's me," I assured her, trying to rub her arms. She blinked open her teary eyes, and I released my grip on her. Her face was sullen and she continued to try and force breaths, and to no avail. "I am sorry," she cried. No, I hushed her, wrapping my arms around her. I held her against my chest, her back to me, gently rocking her. She continued to hyperventilate. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. And I began to fear her lack of oxygen. "Evelyn, you're having a panic attack," I whispered in her ear. "I want you to find 5 things you see and say them out loud." I knew the signs of a panic attack all too well, and luckily had learned ways to cope with them from my therapist drive. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, Heartfelt thanks for your unfading patience, enthusiasm. Evelyn nodded, scanning her periphery. She breathed. She breathed. Sheets. She breathed. Kilo. WS. She breathed. Be dead. Her breathing was still small and in incomplete gasps as I tried to get her to continue. Agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nelbe. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Good, I assured, rubbing her shoulders. Now say for things you feel. W. Warmth. S. Sheet. Soft CL. Clothes. She placed her hand on her chest. Why you? Name 3 things you hear. I whispered. Be breath. TBAC. Wind. Her gasps had decreased to small shaky breaths and relief began to fill me. To things you smell. I urged her. Pine. Coffee. I lightly smiled at her noticing my scent. One thing you taste. She closed her eyes and smiled. Mint toothpaste. I hugged her tightly, her breathing now even. I had been so scared that she was gone. So scared she was hurt. I was relieved that she wasn't. But holding her tightly relieved my inner wolf's anxiety about her well-being. I began to softly hum, hoping to calm her further. I felt her begin to slacken in my arms and I moved to gently lay her down in bed. Reaching for the cover, I went to pull away and cover her when she reached her hands out and grabbed the collar of my shirt. In a small voice, she whispered, "Please don't leave. I don't want to be alone." My heart thundered in my chest. She wanted me to stay. Me, she felt. Safe. I felt an overwhelming sense of happiness fill me at that. Still, I didn't want to take advantage of her vulnerable state and her be uncomfortable in the morning. Are you sure? Evelyn. She nodded without opening an eye, arms reaching out. I chuckled to myself at her adorable behavior. Something about her tender affection only drove me to want to take care of and protect her more. Sliding into bed, Evelyn turned on her side, as I wrapped my arms around her waist. Holding her against me was heaven, my own sleeping angel tucked safely away in my arms. Beside her, I felt that not only I could protect her, but, in some way she could protect me. My grin only widened at the memory. Then, realization struck me. I hadn't had nightmares. Every night since that night, I had been burdened with ceaseless nightmares. Nightmares of them. My mother turned to me. "You killed me, you evil child. I wish you had never been born." Her screams echoed in my mind. In the nightmare I was in my childhood flesh, tears pouring down my face. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nelben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. "Don't call me Mummy," she snarled. "You never even knew me." I hiccuped. "I didn't know my birth would kill you." I'm sorry, Mommy." "Who are you talking to, Max?" a little boy asked. I spun around. The scenery had changed to a forest. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nelben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Where it all happened, I was suddenly older. In my awkward 12-year-old body, long skinny limbs which didn't fit my large stature. I asked in shock. My eyes went wide and I rushed towards him. My arms reached out, ready to snatch him up in my arms to safety, away from the evil of the world. Out of the corner of my eye, a dark figure flashed by. Blood, matted hair, broken bones, the mangled corpse of a 7-year-old boy. I heaved the contents of my stomach, tears and snot pouring down my face, wiping my mouth on my sleeve. I looked up and was transported to the basement of my childhood home. Looking around, I made eye contact with her, the mean aunt. She gave me an evil grin. "You killed your mother." She stepped forward with a silver chain, a gloved hand holding it. "You killed your brother." She stepped forward again, the chain grating against the cement floor. "You are a curse." To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nelben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. She screamed at me. You deserve to be punished. I nodded. My body sagged. I deserve to be punished. Crack. Pain. Crack. Pain. The silver chain slammed against my back, making it raw and bleed. No one believed you. Crack. No one believes a monster. She screamed. No one saw the rogues that day. No one smelled them. It was an illusion I created in my head, they said. You killed Charlie. She let out a mangled sob, almost a scream. You killed my baby. She roared, slamming the chain against my back. That time it dug deep into my skin and I couldn't help but let out a scream. Me. I am a murderer. I deserve this. Hey, are you okay? Evelyn asked me, gently touching my jaw. I flinched and she took a sharp breath in. I shook my head, snapping myself out of it, and grabbed her hand, holding it back against my cheek. Yeah, I'm fine. I let go of her hand and shifted my weight to my elbow. How are you? I asked her, gazing into her eyes. I was concerned Evelyn could be suffering from PTSD from falling in the ice. Mates were already protective but nature, and my wolf was growing increasingly agitated. My primal instinct to mark her was growing by the day, but I found that being near her and touching her helped to placate it. I'm okay. She feigned a smile, but the slight shrug in her shoulders and downcast gaze let me see right through it. Evelyn, I whispered, pushing a tendril of her golden hair behind her ear. You know it's okay to be struggling, right? What you went through was, I don't want to talk about it. Her voice cracked. Tears welled up in her eyes and she wiped them with her hand. I'm okay, she whispered and looked at me. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noble, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I nodded, whispering an okay, before hugging her more tightly and pressing a kiss to her forehead. Releasing her, I offered a smile. What would you like for breakfast? She rubbed her eyes and sat up in bed. I couldn't help but notice the way her tousled hair glowed from the sun shining through the window. It illuminated her pale skin, making the freckles that dusted her face and arms stand out. She looked ethereal and I reminisced in the moment. Enthusiasm. She pressed together. I'll eat anything. She smiled, getting out of bed. Evelyn followed, slipping on her UG slippers. We walked down the corridor, and then the stairs down to the kitchen. Opening the fridge, I pulled out eggs, bagels, cream cheese, and fruit, and placed them on the marble countertops. Is this okay? I turned and asked her. She smiled and nodded. What can I do to help? I don't mind taking care of everything if you want to rest for a bit. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noble, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I didn't want her to have to do anything, but, especially not after last night, I felt on edge and cooking was a safety hazard. No, I want to help. Honestly, please. What can I do? She asked with begging eyes. I was immediately rendered unable to say no as I looked at her adorable begging expression. I looked around the kitchen for something safe she could do. Why don't you set the table? She smiled eagerly and nodded, immediately going to work to find all the items. While she did that, I began scrambling eggs and popped the bagels into a toaster. I also began brewing some coffee. In a few minutes, I stopped crumbling the eggs, and the coffee pot beeped. I'll pour you some, Evelyn called to me, walking quickly to the coffee maker. I watched in slow motion as her foot caught under the kitchen mat and she fell forward, rib cage connecting with the marble corner of the aisle. I raced towards her, catching her before any more damage was done, holding her in my arms. My heart raced and I felt my eyes darken. My canines threatened to protrude into my mouth. My wolf side was threatening to emerge. My wolf and I were one, my wolf like my subconscious guide. But it pushed so much to the surface. It was as if it was chanting to me, mark mate, protect mate, mark mate, need to mark mate to protect mate. Max, I'm okay. I pulled her into my chest, squashing her against me. As I burrowed my face into her hair and shoulder, I took deep breaths in of her scent, roses, lavender, and fresh cotton. Max, Evelyn squeaked. I held her a few moments, allowing my wolf to calm down and retract back to the confines of my mind. Then, I slowly released her, taking in her wide-eyed and confused expression. I'm sorry, Evelyn. I've been on edge since we arrived and when you got hurt. My wolf was trying to surface. I needed to calm down. Her face only grew more perplexed. You always mention your wolf. Is it like a Willa? I raised my eyebrows and grinned. Split personality. She made a hilarious face as she shrugged her shoulders and whispered, yes. I chuckled. No, it's not. More like my animal instincts as a werewolf. When I'm in my wolf form, or a threat is perceived, my wolf comes to surface more, and those instincts are pushed forward. But I don't understand. You weren't in your wolf form, and I'm not a threat. I stepped forward, tenderly holding her shoulders and leaning down more so she could look me in the eye. But most of all, my wolf wants me to protect my mate. The family unit is the most core value of being a wolf. We are pack animals, and our mates are the most important thing to us. I gazed into her eyes, noticing a small smile that she tried to hide tugging at the corners of her mouth. I was filled with a sense of contentment at the admission, as I gazed down at her blushing face. Well, Evelyn cleared her throat. Should we eat breakfast? I nodded, pressing a kiss to her forehead before turning her around and placing my hands on her shoulders. Leaning in, I whispered in her ear, would you please go into the dining room and let me do the rest? She nodded soundlessly, taking a step forward toward the dining room. And don't get hurt, I called out to her. Sighing, I waited until she was out of sight before gripping the kitchen island. Even her being the slightest bit out of my sight was driving my wolf insane. I should have known that after her almost dying my wolf would be driven mad. But I didn't think it would be this bad when she was living with me. I needed to mark her for my wolf and my own sanity. But I wouldn't do it unless she wanted me to. It was her decision, and just because I needed to didn't mean I didn't want her to decide for herself. Sooner or later, I would have to explain. But for now, I loaded the plates up with food and brought them to my smiling mate. Maximus, why can't I help? My mate half-wind. Cuff demanded an answer. I had refused to allow her to help me clean the dishes, and now as I cleaned the pots and pans I continued to refuse. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nelban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. She glared, crossing her arms. You do know I am actually capable of washing dishes without hurting myself. Right. I turned to her sign. As much as I had admired her headstrong nature since we met, at this moment, I really wished she would stop. Watching her do anything gave me a threatening anxiety. My shoulders sagged, knowing I had to concede. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nelban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I paused, handing her the sponge and pan. She sent me a gleaming smile in return, taking it from my hands. It all proved worth it as I reacted by having a fluttering in my stomach and catching my breath. She was radiant. The joy that exuded from her came in contagious waves. She hummed to herself as she washed the pan, and I watched each hand movement carefully. She scrubbed up and down until it was spotless. Before rinsing the soapy suds off in warm water, she placed it on the drying rack before turning around and facing me. See, she jokingly huffed, crossing her arms. A smile played at her lips as she turned and glanced at the pan she had just washed. I am not incapable of basic tasks, Maximus. I grinned, and stepped forward. I know. I conceded. I've just been worried about you. Evelyn's eyes softened a bit, looking up at me with a delicate expression. There was a sweetness in her gaze as she gently grabbed my hand. She gave it a tender squeeze before saying, I know, Maximus. But I'm okay. Yes, she was okay now. But she hadn't been. She still wasn't truly, although the light had returned to her eyes, and her skin's color had returned to it. She was still much thinner than how I had left her over a month ago. Images of her limp, almost dead body drenched in icy water flashed in my mind, and my wolf pressed forward again. I took her hand and placed it on my cheek. I closed my eyes, deeply inhaling her scent. When I opened them, "Want to watch a movie?" She nodded her head with a smile. When I turned to walk up the stairs, she shot me a questioning gaze. I motioned for her to follow, turning down the corridor that her bedroom was on. I opened up a door that was adjacent to the guest rooms. Walking in, Evelyn gasped and then widened her smile. We had walked into my movie theater. The walls were covered in dark paint, with small dim light. It had a screen that took up the right wall, and a rows of plush red seats. A popcorn machine sat in the corner of the room. "What movie do you want to watch?" I asked her. I pulled out an array of discs, each with a movie label. She glanced over my arm, at the discs I had pulled out. "The Quiet Place." She smiled. I raised my brows in surprise before nodding, a grin tugging at my lips. We sat down next to each other on the velvet seats and looked up at the screen. I watched with amusement each time Evelyn's eyes would widen or her breath would catch in her throat. When the movie had progressed and the mother was giving birth with the monster right around the corner, Evelyn's hand flew to mine, squeezing it and shutting her eyes tightly. Seizing the moment, I moved the cup holder between us and put an arm around her, allowing her to bury her face into my shoulder. We finished the movie, and Evelyn turned to me with a smile. "That was so good." She smiled before blushing when she glanced at our intertwined hands. "Want to watch another?" I asked her with a mischievous grin. The rest of the day was spent watching movies together and playing games. Throughout the day, we learned more about each other. Evelyn's favorite food was chicken pot pie. My favorite was steak. Her favorite movie was A White Christmas, which was also mine. Her favorite animal was elk, while mine was obviously wolves. In addition, I quickly discovered that my mate was incredibly competitive, especially when it came to Scrabble. "Xylophone." She smiled, looking at me with a victorious grin. We were both laying on the carpet in the living room, the Scrabble board almost full. 6, I spelled out. There was no more room on the board. Evelyn grabbed the notepad and pencil I had given her, adding our final points. I watched as a slight grin emerged on her face that she quickly stifled. She cleared her throat, and the winner I SSCCS. She paused with a grin at me. She sat up on her knees, rolling her arms and turning from side to side. "You are a cheater." Nearing her more. "Oh no, I am not," she denied in a light tone. She backed away as I got nearer. Moving from her knees, she fell back on her butt and I laughed. "Do I have to force you to admit your guilt?" "I'm not guilty." She narrowed her eyes, smirking. "Well, I guess in that case." I trailed off before reaching my hands out and tickling her. She was flat on her back at this point, as I leaned over her and tickled. No," she laughed and gasped. Stop." She laughed again. I continued my assault. "Admit it, you're a cheater," I urged, continuing to tickle her. No, fine. She laughed. Yes, I am." I stopped tickling her and laughed. She crossed her arms and looked up at me with a glare. "I am not a cheater. Do I need to tickle you again?" Her eyes went wide. No, you do not." I laughed and looked down at her beautiful form. Her golden tresses were spread out on the carpet, her cheeks with a rosy color to them from laughing. I leaned down towards her, brushing a piece of hair out of her face. This close, I could hear her heart beating wildly in her chest. Or was it my own? Her breath caught in her throat, and before I could question myself, I leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to her lips. I pulled back and found myself surprised when she reached her hands out tentatively and gently grabbed my face. She pulled me in to kiss her again. Our lips softly pressed against one another. Then, she wrapped her arms around my neck, in a hug, and I pulled her up. her seated in my lap as she buried her head into my shoulder. I wrapped my arms around her, basking in the feeling of a hug. I hadn't been hugged in years, with the exception of an occasional embrace from Connor. But that was different. That wasn't the sheer affection of being hugged. It felt nice. It felt really nice. Pulling back, Evelyn smiled at me. "This has been really fun. Thank you for a great day. I'm sure you had more important things to do." I chuckled and shook my head. There is nothing more important for me to be doing but what I am right now. A blush so red it extended from her cheeks to her ears spread across her face as she tucked a wisp of hair behind her ear. "Well, nevertheless, thank you." She smiled. She stood up. "I think I'm going to head to bed." I stood as well, worry filling my heart. "Please, get me if you need anything," I reminded her. She smiled and nodded. "I will." I watched as she went up the stairs and away from view, feeling my wolf practically claw at me from the inside to go after her. Taking a deep breath, I waited a few minutes from downstairs, hearing running water and clothing being put into drawers. Then, I heard the slightest creak of a bed. Walking up the stairs, I sat on the floor outside her bedroom, leaning against the door. I would stay all night long if it meant making sure I was there to ward off her nightmares.